Detective Maria Santos held the faded index card between latex-gloved fingers, studying the careful cursive handwriting that had remained unchanged since 1985. The recipe for Eleanor Blackwood's famous apple cinnamon cake appeared unremarkable at first glance: flour, sugar, eggs, and spices measured out in her grandmother's precise script. But embedded within the innocent list of ingredients, Santos had discovered something that made her pulse quicken. A pattern of seemingly random numbers that corresponded exactly to coordinates, marking a location 15 miles from where Eleanor Blackwood had vanished 39 years ago. The discovery had emerged from an unlikely source. Earlier that week, Eleanor's granddaughter, Jessica Blackwood Chen, had contacted the Riverside County Sheriff's Department about donating her late grandmother's recipe collection to the Historical Society. While organizing the cards alphabetically, Jessica had noticed peculiarities in several recipes measurements that seemed excessive, ingredients listed in unusual orders, and numbers that didn't quite make sense for their stated purposes. When she mentioned these oddities to her sister-in-law, a retired mathematics teacher, they had begun to suspect the recipes might contain some form of code. Santos had been working cold cases for 12 years, long enough to know that breakthrough moments often came from unexpected directions. The Blackwood disappearance had been one of Riverside County's most perplexing mysteries, generating thousands of tips and countless investigative hours without producing a single solid lead. Eleanor Blackwood, 68 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had walked away from her daughter's house during a family barbecue on July 14, 1985. Despite extensive searches involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, no trace of Eleanor had ever been found. The official theory had been that Eleanor, confused by her advancing condition, had wandered into the vast deserts surrounding the town of Desert Springs and succumbed to the July heat. The harsh landscape had claimed other missing persons over the years, and Eleanor's small frame and confused mental state made survival unlikely beyond the first few days. After 6 months of intensive searching, the case had been classified as a presumed death, though Eleanor's body was never recovered. Santos spread the recipe cards across her desk in the bullpen of the sheriff's station, comparing the numerical anomalies Jessica had identified. The apple cinnamon cake recipe called for 38 degrees of nutmeg and 117 minutes of mixing time, measurements that made no culinary sense but corresponded precisely to GPS coordinates: 38.7543 degrees north, 117.2891 degrees west. When Santos plugged these coordinates into her computer mapping system, they pointed to a remote location in the Mojave Desert, near the abandoned mining town of Goldfield Creek. Detective Paul Reeves joined Santos at her desk, bringing with him the sharp scent of the gas station coffee that had sustained him through 26 years of law enforcement. Reeves had been a rookie deputy when Eleanor disappeared, and he remembered the case with the clarity that comes from experiencing your first major investigation. His weathered face carried the accumulated weight of too many unsolved mysteries, but his eyes showed the spark of renewed interest that came with potential evidence. "You're thinking Eleanor left us a treasure map in her cooking cards?" Reeves asked, settling into the chair beside Santos's desk. His skepticism was gentle but evident. After 2.5 decades of dead ends, he had learned to temper hope with hard-earned realism. Santos pulled up a detailed topographical map on her computer screen, zooming in on the coordinates. The location appeared to be in a section of BLM land characterized by Joshua trees, scrub brush, and scattered rock formations. According to the Geological Survey, the area contained several abandoned mine shafts from the 1920s gold rush, along with the remnants of a narrow-gauge railroad that had once connected the mining camps to the main Southern Pacific line. "Look at this," Santos said, pointing to additional recipes spread across her desk. Eleanor's chocolate chip cookies call for 1847 chips. That's the year gold was discovered in California. Her beef stew needs 49 pounds of meat, 1849, the height of the gold rush. And her bread recipe specifies 165 degrees of heat for 23 minutes. Santos paused to let the implications sink in. 165.23 could be another set of coordinates, or it could be a bearing and distance from the first location. Reeves leaned closer to examine the cards, his skepticism gradually giving way to curiosity. The handwriting was definitely Eleanor's. He recognized it from the missing person report she had filled out when her husband had briefly gone missing during a fishing trip in 1982. But the recipes themselves contained ingredients and measurements that suggested someone who understood both cooking and navigation, a combination that seemed unlikely for a woman entering the early stages of dementia. "When did Eleanor's condition start manifesting?" Santos asked, pulling up the medical records that had been part of the original investigation. Reeves consulted his notes, pages now yellowed with age, but still legible. According to her daughter Linda, Eleanor had been showing signs of confusion for about 18 months before she disappeared. Nothing dramatic. Forgetting appointments, repeating conversations, getting lost driving to familiar places. But her long-term memory was still sharp, and she could still cook her favorite recipes without referring to cards. Santos felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when seemingly unrelated facts began forming a pattern. If Eleanor's short-term memory was failing but her long-term memory remained intact, she might have embedded information in the recipes as a form of insurance, a way to preserve crucial knowledge even if her mind continued to deteriorate. The question was what information Eleanor thought important enough to encode, and why she had felt the need to hide it. The drive to Goldfield Creek took Santos and Reeves through 90 minutes of increasingly desolate landscape. They left Desert Springs in the pre-dawn darkness, hoping to reach the coordinates before the July heat became unbearable. The temperature at 5 a.m. already hovered near 80 degrees, and the Weather Service predicted afternoon highs exceeding 115 degrees, conditions that could prove fatal for anyone unprepared for the desert's harsh realities. The asphalt gave way to graded dirt road about 40 miles from town, and the dirt road eventually deteriorated into barely visible tire tracks winding between stands of creosote and barrel cactus. Santos drove slowly, following her GPS unit while Reeves monitored their position on the topographical map. The landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mountain ranges that shimmered in the morning heat like mirages. They found the coordinates marked by a cluster of Joshua trees surrounding a depression in the earth that might once have been a waterhole. Santos parked the SUV in the meager shade provided by the largest tree and checked her GPS reading. They were within 50 feet of the position indicated by Eleanor's recipe, close enough to begin a systematic search of the immediate area. The ground here told a story written in rocks and sand, though Santos needed time to learn how to read it. Animal tracks crisscrossed the hardpan earth coyotes, rabbits, and the distinctive pad marks of a mountain lion. But there were also signs of human presence. Tire tracks too old to date precisely, scattered pieces of rusted metal that might have come from mining equipment, and a concrete culvert that seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere. Reeves discovered the first significant clue while examining the concrete structure. What had appeared to be a drainage culvert was actually a carefully constructed cache, designed to protect its contents from the elements. The concrete cylinder had been sealed at both ends with removable caps, creating a waterproof storage space about 3 feet long and 8 inches in diameter. One cap had worked loose over the decades, allowing sand and small debris to accumulate inside. "There's something in here," Reeves called, shining his flashlight into the opening. Santos joined him beside the culvert, and together they carefully extracted what appeared to be a plastic bag wrapped around a bundle of papers. The bag had been secured with duct tape that had somehow maintained its integrity, despite nearly 4 decades of temperature extremes. Inside the bag, Santos found a collection of documents that made her hands tremble despite the morning heat. Bank statements showing regular deposits of large cash amounts into Eleanor Blackwood's savings account between 1978 and 1985. Photocopies of receipts for precious metals purchases from a Las Vegas dealer. And most disturbing of all, a handwritten letter in Eleanor's distinctive script, dated 3 days before her disappearance. "If anyone finds this, it means I was right about what would happen to me," the letter began. "Harold has been stealing from the mine for 7 years, and I've been helping him hide the evidence. I thought we were being clever, taking only enough to secure our retirement without drawing attention. But Harold has gotten greedy, and now he wants to take everything. He thinks I'm too confused to remember where we hid the gold, but my mind isn't as far gone as I let people believe. I'm writing this as insurance, in case Harold decides I know too much." Santos read the letter twice before the full implications sank in. Harold Blackwood, Eleanor's deceased husband, had apparently been involved in theft from one of the area's active mining operations. Eleanor had not only known about the theft but had participated in concealing the stolen gold. The cache they had discovered was not just evidence of a crime, but potentially the location where the stolen materials had been hidden. The letter continued with details that painted a picture of a marriage built on shared deception. Harold had worked as a security guard at the Mojave gold mine, a position that gave him access to areas where raw ore samples were stored before processing. Over several years, he had systematically stolen high-grade ore, replacing it with lower-quality material in quantities too small to trigger immediate detection. Eleanor had helped him transport and hide the stolen ore, using her familiarity with desert roads and abandoned mining sites to identify secure storage locations. "Harold died in March," the letter explained, "and I thought our secret died with him. But yesterday, I found evidence that someone else knows about the stolen gold. Someone has been watching the house, and I've seen the same truck parked at the end of our street 3 times this week. I'm scared that whoever it is will hurt Linda or the grandchildren to make me tell them where Harold hid everything." Santos felt a chill despite the rising desert heat. Eleanor Blackwood hadn't wandered away in confusion. She had been running from someone who posed a threat to her family. The woman's apparent dementia might have been partially genuine, but she had clearly retained enough mental clarity to recognize danger and attempt to protect her loved ones. The letter's final paragraphs provided specific coordinates for 3 additional locations where Harold had buried stolen ore. Eleanor had documented each site with the same precision she had used in her coded recipes, creating a treasure map that could only be interpreted by someone who understood her system. She had also included a confession of her role in the thefts, expressing remorse for her actions while explaining the financial pressures that had motivated their crimes. "We never meant to hurt anyone," Eleanor had written. "Harold lost most of his pension when the mine scaled back operations, and we were facing the possibility of losing our house. The stolen gold was supposed to be temporary insurance, something to sell if we faced a real emergency. But it became easier to take a little more each time, and before we knew it, we had accumulated enough stolen ore to last us for years." Reeves had been quiet while Santos read the letter, but now he voiced the question that was troubling them both. If Eleanor was running from someone in 1985, where the hell has she been for 39 years? Santos studied the topographical map, focusing on the 3 additional coordinates Eleanor had provided. One location was approximately 2 miles northwest of their current position, near the abandoned settlement of Goldfield Creek. The second was farther south, near a series of mine shafts that had been sealed by the Bureau of Land Management in the 1990s. The third location appeared to be closer to civilization, near the current boundary of the Mojave Gold Mine property. They decided to investigate the closest location first, following a dry wash that meandered northwest through increasingly rocky terrain. The GPS coordinates led them to what appeared to be another abandoned mining claim, marked by a pile of tailings and the collapsed frame of a wooden headhouse. Santos parked near the ruins, and they began a careful search of the immediate areas. Reeves found the second cache buried beneath a cairn of stones near the base of the collapsed structure. This container was larger than the first, a military surplus ammunition box that had been wrapped in plastic and buried about 3 feet underground. Inside, they discovered approximately 20 pounds of raw gold ore, along with documentation that confirmed Eleanor's story about Harold's thefts from the Mojave Gold Mine. The ore samples were beautiful in their own right, chunks of quartz veined with gleaming gold that caught the morning sunlight like captured fire. But Santos found herself more interested in the documentation that accompanied the samples. Harold had kept meticulous records of his thefts, including dates, quantities, and the specific locations within the mine where he had obtained the ore. His notes revealed a sophisticated understanding of the mine's operations and security procedures, suggesting that his thefts had been carefully planned rather than opportunistic. One document in particular caught Santos's attention, a letter from Harold to Eleanor dated just a week before his death. In it, Harold expressed concerns about a fellow mine employee who had begun asking questions about inventory discrepancies. The letter suggested that Harold feared exposure and was considering whether to confess to the thefts or attempt to frame someone else for the missing ore. Eleanor wasn't just afraid of random criminals, Santos realized, speaking her thoughts aloud. She was afraid of Harold's accomplice, someone who knew about the thefts and wanted to claim the stolen gold for themselves. The investigation took on new urgency as Santos and Reeves realized they were dealing with more than just a missing person case. If Eleanor had been murdered in 1985, her killer had been free for nearly 4 decades. More disturbing was the possibility that Eleanor might still be alive, hidden somewhere in the vast desert while her family mourned her presumed death. They spent the remainder of the morning investigating the third cache location, which proved to be the most revealing yet. Buried near a lightning-struck Joshua tree, They found a waterproof container holding Eleanor's jewelry, several $1,000s in cash, and a detailed map showing safe routes through the desert to various water sources and abandoned settlements. The map suggested that Eleanor had been preparing for the possibility of long-term survival in the wilderness. But the most significant discovery was a spiral-bound notebook containing Eleanor's daily journal entries from the weeks before her disappearance. The entries revealed a woman living in constant fear, documenting suspicious vehicles, strange phone calls, and evidence that someone had searched her house while she was away. Eleanor had identified her stalker as Frank Morrison, Harold's former supervisor at the mine, who had apparently discovered the theft after Harold's death and was attempting to blackmail Eleanor into revealing the location of the stolen gold. Frank came to the house again today, one entry read. He says he knows what Harold was doing and that he has evidence that could send me to prison. He wants half of everything, or he'll go to the police and tell them I was Harold's accomplice. I told him I don't know what he's talking about, but I can see in his eyes that he doesn't believe me. The journal's final entry, dated the morning of Eleanor's disappearance, contained a chilling revelation. Frank Morrison had given Eleanor an ultimatum: meet him at a specified location in the desert to discuss the division of the stolen gold, or face arrest and the possibility that her family would be harmed. Eleanor had decided to keep the appointment, but she had also made preparations for the possibility that Morrison intended to kill her rather than negotiate. I'm leaving this afternoon to meet Frank at the old mine shaft near Rabbit Springs, the final entry stated. I've hidden copies of everything in the places Harold and I established, along with enough evidence to prove Frank's involvement if something happens to me. If I don't come back, I hope someday someone will find this and make sure Linda and the children are safe. Santos and Reeves returned to town that evening with a vehicle full of evidence and a growing list of questions that needed answers. The first priority was determining whether Frank Morrison was still alive and whether he posed a continuing threat to the Blackwood family. A records check revealed that Morrison had died in a single-car accident in Nevada in 1987, 2 years after Eleanor's disappearance. The accident report described Morrison as apparently intoxicated, with his vehicle leaving the road and rolling down an embankment near Lake Tahoe. But Morrison's death raised as many questions as it answered. If he had killed Eleanor in 1985, what had happened to her body? And if Eleanor had somehow survived their confrontation, where had she been living for the past 39 years? The evidence suggested that Eleanor had been preparing for extended survival in the desert, but the harsh environment made long-term survival seem impossible for a 68-year-old woman with limited resources. Santos decided to investigate the location where Eleanor had planned to meet Morrison, an abandoned mine shaft near Rabbit Springs, about 20 miles southeast of Desert Springs. The area was known to local law enforcement as a dumping ground for stolen vehicles and other unwanted evidence, and several bodies had been recovered from mine shafts in the region over the years. If Morrison had killed Eleanor as planned, the mine shaft would be a logical place to dispose of her body. The Rabbit Springs area proved to be a maze of abandoned mining claims, collapsed structures, and dangerous mine shafts that had been inadequately sealed. Santos and Reeves approached the investigation with extreme caution, aware that a wrong step could send them plummeting into depths that had already claimed the lives of several unauthorized explorers. They contacted the county's mine safety specialist, who agreed to assist with the search using specialized equipment designed for underground rescue operations. The search took 3 days, with teams systematically exploring each shaft using remote cameras and sophisticated lighting equipment. They found evidence of human activity in several locations: abandoned camping gear, empty food containers, and makeshift shelters that suggested someone had been living in the underground spaces. But it wasn't until they reached the deepest accessible level of the main shaft that they made the discovery that would transform the investigation. Approximately 40 feet below ground level, investigators found a carefully constructed living space that had been inhabited for an extended period. The area included a sleeping area made from salvaged materials, a cooking space with a small camp stove, and storage areas containing canned food, water containers, and personal belongings. Most remarkably, the space included a ventilation system that drew fresh air from the surface through a network of natural fissures in the rock. Among the personal belongings, Santos found items that had belonged to Eleanor Blackwood clothing described in the original missing person report, prescription medications in Eleanor's name, and a worn photograph of her grandchildren. But the most shocking discovery was a recent newspaper dated just 6 months earlier suggesting that someone had been living in the underground space as recently as 2023. The medical examiner's analysis of biological evidence found in the underground shelter confirmed what Santos had begun to suspect. Eleanor Blackwood had survived her confrontation with Frank Morrison and had been living in the abandoned mineshaft for nearly 4 decades. DNA samples from hair and other traces matched Eleanor's genetic profile, which had been established from personal items collected during the original investigation. But the evidence also revealed a heartbreaking truth about Eleanor's final years. The prescription medications found in the shelter included drugs for treating advanced dementia, suggesting that Eleanor's mental condition had continued to deteriorate during her decades of isolation. The most recent prescriptions were dated only 8 months before Santos and Reeves discovered the shelter, indicating that Eleanor had maintained contact with someone who could provide medical care. The investigation into Eleanor's medical care led Santos to Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a retired physician who had operated a mobile clinic serving the region's homeless and transient population. Dr. Hendricks initially denied any knowledge of Eleanor Blackwood, but when confronted with prescription records and the threat of prosecution for failure to report a missing person, she eventually admitted to providing medical care to Eleanor for over 30 years. "She made me promise never to tell anyone where she was," Dr. Hendricks explained during an emotional interview at the sheriff's station. "She was terrified that someone would hurt her family if they knew she was still alive. She said she had seen what this person was capable of, and that her death was the only thing protecting her daughter and grandchildren." According to Dr. Hendricks, Eleanor had initially approached her in 1986, nearly dead from exposure and malnutrition after surviving in the desert for almost a year. Eleanor had told the doctor that she had been attacked by someone who wanted information about stolen gold, and that she had played dead until her attacker left her body in the mine shaft. When she regained consciousness, Eleanor had realized that her apparent death might be the only way to protect her family from further violence. "She was remarkably resourceful," Dr. Hendricks continued. "She knew the desert better than most people realize, and she had prepared for the possibility of having to survive on her own. She found water sources that weren't on any maps, and she knew which plants were safe to eat. But the isolation was destroying her mentally, even before the dementia started affecting her." Over the years, Dr. Hendricks had helped Eleanor establish a sustainable existence in the underground shelter. The doctor had provided medical care, prescription medications, and regular supplies of food and other necessities. In exchange, Eleanor had insisted on paying for everything with gold ore from the caches she and Harold had hidden throughout the desert. Dr. Hendricks had sold the gold through contacts in Las Vegas, using the proceeds to fund her mobile clinic and support Eleanor's needs. The arrangement had continued until Eleanor's death the previous winter, when advancing dementia had made it impossible for her to care for herself safely. Dr. Hendricks had found Eleanor's body during a routine supply visit in February 2024, apparently having died peacefully in her sleep. Unable to report the death without revealing Eleanor's decades of concealment, Dr. Hendricks had buried Eleanor in a simple grave near the mine shaft, marking the location with a small stone cairn. Santos and Reeves recovered Eleanor's remains from the grave Dr. Hendricks described, finally bringing closure to a case that had haunted the community for nearly 4 decades. The medical examiner confirmed that Eleanor had died from natural causes consistent with advanced age and dementia, with no evidence of violence or foul play. She had survived in the desert for 39 years, protecting her family from a threat that had ended with Frank Morrison's death in 1987, though Eleanor had never learned that her tormentor was gone. The discovery of Eleanor's fate provided answers to some questions while raising others that would never be fully resolved. The stolen gold cached throughout the desert was eventually recovered and returned to the Mojave gold mine, though much of it had been used over the years to fund Eleanor's survival and Dr. Hendricks's charitable medical work. The mine's insurance company elected not to pursue prosecution, recognizing that the principals in the theft had been dead for years. Eleanor's family struggled to process the revelation that their beloved grandmother had been alive for decades while they mourned her death. Linda Blackwood, now 67 herself, found it difficult to reconcile the woman who had baked cookies and told bedtime stories with someone capable of surviving alone in the harsh desert for nearly 40 years. The family's grief was complicated by anger at Eleanor's decision to let them believe she was dead, even though they intellectually understood her motivation to protect them. Jessica Blackwood Chen, who had discovered the coded recipes that broke the case open, found herself wondering how many other family secrets might be hidden in seemingly innocent heirlooms. She began researching her grandmother's life more systematically, discovering that Eleanor had been far more complex and resourceful than anyone had realized. The recipes that had contained the hidden coordinates were just one example of Eleanor's ability to encode important information in everyday objects. Santos's investigation revealed that Eleanor had been in contact with several other people over the years, though most had believed they were helping a homeless woman rather than someone with a family searching for her. A network of desert hermits, seasonal workers, and transient individuals had occasionally provided Eleanor with supplies or information, creating an informal support system that had enabled her long-term survival. The case also exposed significant gaps in the missing person investigation protocols of the 1980s. Eleanor's apparent dementia had led investigators to focus on the possibility of accidental death rather than considering that she might have been fleeing from a credible threat. The failure to thoroughly investigate Eleanor's finances had prevented discovery of the bank deposits that might have revealed Harold's theft and Frank Morrison's subsequent blackmail attempts. Dr. Hendricks faced potential criminal charges for her failure to report Eleanor's survival, but prosecutors ultimately decided that her actions had been motivated by genuine concern for Eleanor's welfare rather than criminal intent. The doctor received a suspended sentence and agreed to perform community service, continuing the medical outreach work she had been doing for decades. She also provided information that helped investigators locate several other individuals who had been living off the grid in similar circumstances. The Mojave Gold Mine implemented new security procedures designed to prevent the type of systematic theft that Harold Blackwood had carried out. The investigation revealed that the mine's inventory controls had been inadequate during the 1980s, allowing small but consistent losses to go undetected for years. The improvements included better tracking of high-grade ore samples and enhanced background checks for employees with access to valuable materials. Eleanor's underground shelter became the subject of academic study by researchers interested in long-term survival in extreme environments. The modifications Eleanor had made to the natural cave system demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and practical knowledge of engineering principles. Her success in creating a livable space with minimal resources provided insights that could benefit future survival research and emergency preparedness planning. The recipe cards that had originally broken the case were eventually donated to the Riverside County Historical Society, where they were displayed as an example of how ordinary objects could contain extraordinary secrets. Eleanor's coding system was analyzed by cryptography experts, who determined that she had used a sophisticated substitution cipher that would have been extremely difficult to crack without knowledge of her personal interests and experiences. Santos retired from law enforcement 2 years after solving the Eleanor Blackwood case, but she continued to think about the moral complexities it had revealed. Eleanor's decision to disappear had protected her family from potential violence, but it had also caused them decades of unnecessary grief and uncertainty. The case had demonstrated how good intentions could lead to tragic consequences, and how survival sometimes required choices that seemed impossible to justify. The desert location where Eleanor had lived for nearly 4 decades was eventually marked with a small memorial acknowledging her remarkable survival and the love that had motivated her sacrifice. Visitors to the site could see the harsh environment Eleanor had called home, gaining appreciation for both her resourcefulness and the desperation that had driven her to such extreme measures. Linda Blackwood established a foundation in her mother's memory to support missing person investigations and provide resources for families dealing with elder abuse and exploitation. The foundation also funded research into the links between financial crimes and domestic violence, recognizing that Eleanor's story was part of a larger pattern of vulnerability and victimization that affected many elderly individuals. The case files were eventually incorporated into training materials for cold case investigators, emphasizing the importance of examining all available evidence with fresh eyes and modern technology. Eleanor's coded recipes became a famous example of how crucial information could be hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right perspective to reveal its significance. Santos often reflected on the irony that Eleanor's attempt to protect her family had ultimately provided the key to solving her own disappearance. The recipes that Eleanor had encoded with location coordinates had been preserved by the same family members she had been trying to shield from harm. Their discovery had required not just technological advancement, but also the curiosity and persistence of family members who refused to accept that their grandmother's legacy was as simple as it appeared. The Eleanor Blackwood case became a reminder that cold cases could hold surprises that challenged investigators' assumptions about human behavior and family dynamics. Eleanor's 39-year survival in one of North America's harshest environments demonstrated levels of determination and resourcefulness that few people would have believed possible. Her story had revealed that sometimes the most extraordinary events occurred when ordinary people faced impossible choices, and found the strength to endure unimaginable hardships for the sake of those they loved.